To say that something is like something else, a heart's like a pump or something, just, you might think distracts one from the process of really explaining what a heart is. But it's potentially extremely valuable.
Metaphors are very powerful, and you can get trapped in a metaphor. So if your metaphor becomes predictive and preemptive, it stops you seeing things that don't fit within it.
If we're machines, basically the only kind of medicine that's valid is stuff that deals with physics and chemistry, surgery and drugs. They're very effective. We've all benefited from modern medicine. But is this all?
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Yes, beyond the machine, we're here to discuss the power of metaphor in science and as it's applied to us. Basically, we're looking at from Descartes and Harvey, describing the heart as a pump and our bodies as machines, to the modern conceit that our brains must, of course, be computers. Our understanding of the world and ourselves is littered with mechanical metaphors. Are they a good idea? Do they help? Or do we need to move beyond them? To discuss this, we have Joanna Kavenna. Luckily, she's a writer. Her novel Inglorious won the Orange Prize, is that right?
Yes.
Yes. Next to her is Colin Blakemore, neurobiologist, former head of the Medical Research Council, who was once, I think, in my opinion, very accurately described as one of the most powerful scientists in the UK. And to my right, Rupert Sheldrake, who is the Jack Black of biology. He shot to international fame with his book, A New Science of Life, which ruffled scientific feathers all around the world, I think it's fair to say. And he's doing it all over again with his new book, The Science Delusion.
In the 17th century, when it first was put forward, it was a very explicit breaking away from the previous metaphors which were used for explaining nature, which were organisms. God was a kind of organism, nature was a kind of organism, the earth, Mother Earth, was a kind of organism, and organisms were organisms. Instead, after Descartes, they became machines. And why the metaphor was so important is it took the self-organizing properties out of organisms, which depended on their soul previously, and put them in God. As the designer of the machinery, it gave a new kind of theology. God as an engineer, a designer of nature. And so they no longer had any purposes. They were machines. Machines only have no purpose of their own. Their purposes were in God and in man, because only man, angels, and God had spirits or minds. Everything else was inanimate, mechanical. That view, that dualistic view, deeply dualistic view, was collapsed in science by the late 19th century into materialism. Materialists said there aren't two things, matter and spirit, there's just matter. So the mind is nothing but the activity of the brain. Now, collapsing this metaphor into a machine metaphor left it a half metaphor, and the other half keeps creeping back in. Modern mechanistic biology is not mechanistic at all. It's basically crypto-vitalist. What it does is reintroduce the soul in the form of genetic programs or the selfish gene. The selfish gene, a metaphor of Richard Dawkins, endues the molecules of the genes with a vital factor, an entelechy. It means they strive, they compete, they're like Chicago gangsters, they mold matter, they create form. These things are not mechanistic. Dawkins is a success because he's basically a vitalist without knowing it. And that's why he's so successful in his rhetoric. And the genetic program, along with the idea that the mind is like a software program controlling the hardware of the brain, is yet another form of dualistic metaphor. The genetic program programs the organism. A computer program is designed by an intelligent mind, a being, a computer program put in it. So my criticism of modern mechanistic metaphors is that they're dishonest, without even knowing they're dishonest, because they're dualist, not mechanist. If they were thoroughgoing mechanists, their value and their plausibility would collapse. So the attempts to explain consciousness in this framework are impossible. And this is why in the philosophy of mind it's called the hard problem, because there is no explanation for consciousness. And so philosophers of mind like Daniel Dennett, who I was speaking to yesterday, argue that consciousness doesn't really exist. It's an illusion, because the mind is nothing but the brain. Of course, that doesn't explain it, because illusion is a mode of consciousness. It simply presupposes. Now, this wouldn't really matter if it was just an intellectual game, and if it was okay for people to be stuck in rather silly metaphors like the selfish gene. But it has practical implications, and one of them, the most serious, is in medicine. Because the mechanistic way of thinking about humans means that if we're machines, basically the only kind of medicine that's valid is stuff that deals with physics and chemistry, surgery and drugs. They're very effective. We've all benefited from modern medicine. But is this all? Well, no, it isn't. We already know the placebo effect has a huge influence on drug trials. It's usually treated as a nuisance, but it's telling us that what people expect and believe affects their health. We already know that people's health is affected by religious belief, and practice generally extends life by years. Prayer and meditation have beneficial effects. Complementary and alternative therapies work on non-machine metaphors, and yet they seem to work. Yet they're not funded, hardly funded at all for the research. They're marginalized within the National Health Service. There are relentless campaigns by militant materialists to try and expunge homeopathy and other forms of alternative medicine. So, from the NHS. So these metaphors have a big influence on people's thinking and on all our lives. Finally, they're not really working. The better metaphors are the field as a way of understanding matter. In physics, all matter is now understood in terms of fields. And I think in biology, concepts of fields help us, give us a much richer set of metaphors, ones that are actually practical and useful from a research point of view. And we need other metaphors too, including new metaphors for the mind and its relationship and intimate involvement with the body. So that's basically my starting point for this discussion.
That was just the start, ladies and gentlemen, just the start.
Well, as David said, this is a debate about language and metaphor, and I suppose the whole of English literature and everything else is exercised by this fascinating gap in words. So this glorious area of indeterminacy, insecurity and peril when we speak or when we use language. And so each word we use has these associations that are cultural and internal, idiosyncratic, and that's the fascinating thing about any form of expression. And so these words that we're using, is the body a machine? I haven't got time to even begin to start on the convolutions of these terms. The fact that it's only used to mean, as we understand, a device with parts to perform a task, a mechanical task. It's only used from the Enlightenment in that sense. So words shift constantly. And I think in this debate, as David said, we're dealing with Descartes' major metaphor of the Enlightenment. So I think as a poetic conceit, if we receive Descartes' words as poetic and all the ensuing metaphors of the heart as a pump, of blueprints, of cells as miniature factories, these are all poetic metaphors. They're within a massive realm of expression within language. And you could equally say, as John Donne does, that the body is a continent, the body of his lover is a fair world. There's no hierarchy. I don't think there's a hierarchy of terms, of metaphorical terms. You could say, like Tasso does, that the body is the shelter of the soul, if you want to express that as your metaphorical idea of the body. Or Petrarch says the body is a submissive wildcat. So there's a massive range of these metaphors of the body. And their opinions in language, their perspectives, and they're mutable, as I said. I think the problem arises if you suggest that your metaphor is absolute, that it is fixed, and thereby eternally meaningful. And I think also metaphors are very powerful, and you can get trapped in a metaphor. So if your metaphor becomes predictive and preemptive, it stops you seeing things that don't fit within it. You can only see the body as a machine, and that's it. And so you draw what you see into this metaphor rather than looking closely at what there is and trying desperately within this flawed language to define it. So I think that's where my own questioning of this Cartesian metaphor would come from, that I think it's become too omnipresent and too influential in certain areas of, as we're discussing, I suspect, science. And I think it's a half metaphor now, because I think Descartes did so well with it because he kept God in it. So a machine requires an inventor, a creator. So you keep God in your metaphor, whereas without God, it's a semi-metaphor. Or the scientist becomes this agent of creativity. They're defining the world. So that's the only, I'd say, inherent confusion within this metaphor that I think is ungainly, particularly ungainly anyway. So to conclude, I'd say two things. There's a dualistic baggage within this metaphor: the observer, the observed, the sort of innate intelligence, and the stuff over there. It's a binary that may not be useful or interesting anymore. And I'd also say, as Joseph Campbell says, don't take your metaphors literally. And there's a final quote from T.S. Eliot I want to read. Words strain, crack, and sometimes break under burden, under the tension, slip, slide, perish, decay with imprecision, will not stay in place, will not stay still.
I think the first question to ask is what's the value? Is there any value in the use of metaphor in science? You might argue that metaphor is simply a distraction. To say that something is like something else, a heart's like a pump or something, you might think distracts one from the process of really explaining what a heart is. But it's potentially extremely valuable. Metaphor, it seems to me, has two possible roles in description. One is indeed poetic, but I don't think that's what we're talking about, or shouldn't be talking about from a scientific perspective. The other is an expression of present ignorance about exact mechanisms, but a statement of faith in saying, look, I don't fully understand how this bit of biology or living thing works, but to the extent that it works like something that I can explain, then I have reason to believe that there could be underlying causal principles that fall within known laws, regularity, that can equally explain what the bit of biology does. The big problems when it comes to some explanations or partial explanations of that type, to say that the heart is like a pump is almost a description of what the heart is, because the heart is a pump, a small extension of one's definition of what a pump is, employing exactly the same physical principles of the movement of fluid by compressing it, apply equally well to hearts as they do to mechanical devices that we presently call pumps, from bicycle pumps to water pumps. But in the case of the brain, I think you can judge the uncertainty of our present knowledge of mechanism by the huge variety of mechanisms, of metaphors that have been applied to it. Everything from holograms to looms to waterworks to, of course, the currently fashionable computer. Now, that does imply that there's a gulf of ignorance which is too big for metaphors to bridge. But I suspect that what will come out of this venture is a change, is an evolving change in our attitude to both what brains are and to what computers are. And we will emerge with a better understanding of what brains are through a better redefinition of what a computing system is. And the advances in technology in making and designing computers and radical changes in the structure of computer design might in fact inform the way in which brains work. I think the brain is a computer, and I'm willing to defend that statement in the discussion.
Would either of the three of you like to just respond, or would you like to get on to the...
How long?
Well, I just mean if there's something that you specifically want to pick up from one of the other two.
Well,
yeah, okay. You
well,
go first.
almost everything. Let's not get off on homeopathy and complementary medicine and then placebo effect. There's a well-known, well-documented for 40 years biological molecular basis of the placebo effect. The placebos release endorphins. They can be blocked. The placebo effect can be blocked, at least for pain, can be blocked by naloxone, which blocks the effect of opiates. So I think what we're missing in your presentation, Rupert, and is evidence. It's very easy to appeal to generalizations and wishes and pictures, broad pictures. Let's have the facts.
Okay. I agree, yes. Okay.
Yes, I had one thing which was, I wanted to pick up on what Colin was saying about this distinction you made, Colin, between poetic and scientific. And you said, I don't think in science we need to think about the poetic significance of language. And I think, I.A. Richards tried to do this 100 years ago. He said, there's poetic language which is emotive, and then there's scientific language which is veridical because it refers to a real referent. And the riposte from Owen Barfield 100 years ago is referent, meaning, these are all in themselves metaphorical terms. So in the way that you try to forge this distinction, you're instantly within metaphor. And so I'd say that to me is, I think, a major element in this debate, is that distinction, that you cannot forge that distinction, actually, really.
I think there is if I could just respond to that point, that there is, I take the point, there's a continuum in some respects, but there's an important distinction, and that is whether the metaphor is an artifact or whether the metaphor is itself, as it were, a product of nature. A pump or a computer or some physical device made by a person, and therefore the principles of which are not only understood, but which have been instantiated, and they actually do work, is a very solid form of metaphor, because it says, look, we can do the same sort of thing that is being done by this bit of a body, and we know how it's done because we made it. Now, it's very powerful in one respect, very dangerous in another. It's powerful because it reveals potential real mechanisms which are understood. It's dangerous because, of course, if the machine has been made by somebody, the small slip in thinking is that the same mechanism in the body has been made by somebody.
Yes.
That's the danger.
Yes, and also that you're dealing with something that is non-generic with a generic metaphor. So machines are generic and they come off production lines. In a sense, it's meaningless to talk about the body at all. It's meaningful to talk about the machine, but the body, there's no such thing as the body, there are bodies. So you get into this instant slippage in terms.
Can I just ask you, Joanna, do you think that scientists understand the power of metaphor?
Yeah, I think that's a really crucial point, because there's this idea that language within science is a façon de parler. You just say, we need some terms and these are the best we have. And so at the moment it is the computing metaphor that we're talking about. But there's obviously these words, which is what literature is obsessed with, create realities. They create fields. That's another one. The whole notion, Maxwell and the notion of a field. And then, of course, it becomes this physical metaphor. We all think of a field. And I believe Maxwell even said, don't think of a physical field. But you get into instantly these associations.
That's like saying, don't think about, and then you're already thinking about it.
Yes, of course, everybody's transfixed. So I think, yes, absolutely, there's a major problem that there's, again, this separation, poetic versus science. The idea that scientists don't need to be vexed about language, but poets do. And I think, of course, scientists must and should be extremely vexed.
Colin, would you agree that, to some extent, scientists do see their use of words the way they would use a scalpel? You pick it up, you do the job with it, and you put it down.
Scientists have the same job that everybody has in needing to communicate their ideas to other people. And we come with a kind of toolkit of language. So unless we're going to reinvent a whole vocabulary which maps onto the things that we really want to express, we're stuck with conventional words. And I immediately recall an exchange with Peter Hacker, with whom I'm talking later today, about, as he would say, the abuse of the word map by scientists, particularly by neuroscientists, to describe in a casual way some sort of topographic spatial arrangement of nerve fibers or activity or something in the brain. Oh, and I guess Peter, who might even be in the audience, would say immediately, no, it doesn't, because you can't have a map unless, a map is a word which means a thing which is read by a map reader. That is another human being looking at it, who by looking at it can find the way to something. And that's not happening in the brain, that's a Cartesian error. But of course, that's not at all, that implies that that scientists using words like apparently loosely like that have fallen into just a ridiculously naive philosophical trap. And I don't think the majority of them have. They don't think that literally there's a curled up piece of parchment into your head with, with treasure marked with a cross on it. But, where are the other words that we can use?
Yeah.
So if the scientists use the word, then the word has evolved to a new category of usage, which is understood and which works for them. Problem is when it sprays out in the public domain, it's easily misinterpreted. And that's one of the big problems in science communication, that we use a vocabulary which is understood by non-scientists to serve a particular purpose. It has become adopted by science. They know what they mean by it, but there's a gulf of understanding between the two sides.
Rupert, do you accept this notion that the scientists use a metaphor and they know what they're doing with it, but the misinterpretation is just when the great unwashed get their hands on it? Or do you think that perhaps there's the odd scientist who's a little bit bamboozled too, and that there's
Yes.
a quantum leap forward, which would be a very small leap forward?
Yes. Yes. Well, I think most scientists have, especially in Britain, have an extremely narrow education. They just do physics, chemistry, and biology for A level. Maybe do something else, English, perhaps.
You knew it was going to happen.
Yes. Well, isn't that true?
Yes.
Then they have a very specialist education, so they're burrowing down into some tiny bit of nerve connections or molecular biology. They don't have an education in larger metaphors, the use of language, the bigger pattern. Most scientists have their view of the bigger picture from reading things like Nature and New Scientist, scientific journals which have a general account of what's going on in science for other scientists. So even scientists get their bigger picture from popular science.
This metaphor of the body as a machine and more latterly the mind as a machine, is that still a helpful metaphor for approaching those questions?
Well, it depends
or is it running out of...
Well, it depends entirely
running out of steam.
We've sort of circled around the whole
Yeah.
question. It depends entirely what you mean by a machine.
Exactly.
If you mean an instrument
Precisely.
which is made by somebody else to do a job, then it's a lousy metaphor.
But isn't that what the machine means when most people hear the word?
Absolutely not. I mean, when scientists talk about mechanisms, they don't think of it in terms of a made and invented artifact with a divine, maker of brains or people. They think of it as being the kind of causal mechanism that explains how a real piece of machinery works. It doesn't mean that the brain is a gear with cogs or a computer with silicon, but it's the expression of faith that the principles by which brains actually work are similar to those that are captured and instantiated in bits of machinery made by human beings.
Do you think, though, had Descartes lost this whole debate in the 17th century and had Giordano Bruno sort of, or the kind of Paracelsian school of thought about the natural world prevailed through that century and not been eradicated, essentially, do you think then we'd be thinking about the brain in alchemical terms?
Well, no, I mean, we wouldn't be continuing to think in alchemical terms about the brain because the underlying principles of alchemy have been disproved by other routes. And we do continue to develop the notion that the brain is a causal instrument. Well,
like nuclear fission has been disproved. I mean, if you think of any links between alchemy and nuclear fission. But anyway, that's a different debate. But anyway, carry on.
But an awful lot of, as it were, confirmation of the principle that there could be an underlying physical explanation for how brains work has accrued since Tractus de Homine, since the statement that brains are essentially like clocks, except of course for souls.
For the clockmaker, yeah.
Except for the clockmaker. Yeah. So it's a productive idea, and that's what science, in the generative phase of science, that is before the critical evidence that fully implements a new theory emerges. That's terribly important for sustaining the initiative of science. It's ideas around which evidence, initially small-scale evidence, continues to grow, and where there is no disconfirmation.
Would you agree that the machine metaphor has been a powerful one? Do you think it still is?
Well, it certainly is, a matter of fact, a very powerful one, because it is still the very dominant metaphor within science. And many of the triumphs of science that Colin rightly points out have happened because of it. Now, I don't dispute that at all. There's certain aspects of the body that are like machines. The heart is like a pump. The eye's a little bit like a camera in certain respects. But the problem is, I think we're stuck, and we're stuck by being... I think the problem is, you see, 19th century physics is really what biology is based on primarily. It's stuck into an old-fashioned physics. And I say if we're going to use machine metaphors, then we have to take into account modern technologies, which are field-based technologies, which have invisible extensions to the material object. And I think that our minds are extended through our bodies too, not just... I don't think if I have a pain in my big toe, I think the pain's in my big toe. I don't think it's in my brain and then referred to my big toe in some mysterious way. This field metaphor, you see, enables us to get things out of the brain. We still retain the importance of the brain. No one's saying the brain doesn't do anything. But we have, instead of cramming everything into the brain, into a kind of pre-field theory kind of metaphor, we can allow it to spill out far beyond the brain in a post-field theory metaphor. In other words, metaphors that have been available since about 1850.
Colin, if we're going to have metaphors, do we have to be as vigilant about the metaphors as we are with, say, theories? Scientists are very ready to update their theories, but very reluctant to give up on metaphors, which may be holding them back. I had the experience of talking to a heart surgeon who said, look, young man, the heart is a pump and only a pump. Now that second step seemed to be unnecessary. And I think it was founded on the metaphor rather than any theory. Do you think that happens? Do you think that's something scientists...
Well, certainly metaphors do change with the advance of knowledge. If a metaphor becomes unacceptable even as a metaphor because of evidence, then it's abandoned and another one emerges. The reason why scientists often hang on to metaphor is that the complete description which they may be able to give of a process is much less easily communicated than the familiar metaphor they've adopted in the past. So saying the heart is just a pump is, they might say, fine for communication because they really know about the details of how it works, but how else would you express it except by describing all of that detail?
I wonder if there's within this debate, which we haven't yet got to, obviously these are all loaded terms. So the whole Enlightenment idea that reason, the mechanism, is the valuable element, and obviously the unexplained, the irrational is the less valuable. But also the way that's now become, there's something slightly self-loathing, I think, developing about this mechanistic metaphor. If you look at the way that we almost defer, there's Jaron Lanier writes a lot about this, we defer to machines in order to make their rather simple questions seem reasonable at this point. So when you go on the internet and you're asked to explain yourself through a series of very reductive, simple ideas about the human, so that in a way something like Facebook can understand you, and so there's this kind of somewhat sort of inverted notion that we have to subjugate our own variability and vast pliability, the human pliability, to these rather rigid machine etiquettes. And I think the metaphor's almost becoming, it's fixing us to a great degree in our lives on the internet, say, as an example.
Rupert, do you think there's a sense in which some of those metaphors restrict our view of ourselves? They may have an explanatory power in some ways, but is there a trade-off?
I think they do restrict our view of ourselves. I mean, people go around saying, it's in my head, when they're talking about things that are in their mind. People have internalized this view. They've actually accepted the metaphor as a description of themselves. If your mind's inside your head, just processing inside the brain, then it's insulated within the privacy of your skull. Our minds are much more separate than they might otherwise be if they're linked through fields, for example. These metaphors actually affect the way we think of ourselves. And so I think they do have a very restrictive effect. I think if we change metaphors to have broader metaphors, which enable our minds to be seen as bigger than our brains, that extending beyond them in perception, as I was just saying, but also affecting them through our expectations and beliefs.
Can I apologise for the fact that we've only scratched the surface, but it's not really our fault. It's just very large. So, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you if you could thank our guest. If there are some questions, there's a gentleman there, obviously. I think I can't really see you very well, so if I call you a gentleman and you're a lady, please forgive me. You're just heads. That person there.
I'm Dennett, pretending to be a lady.
Yes, okay. And then the gentleman there.
Rupert, you twice used the word dishonest in your characterization of first Dawkins on selfish genes, and then me on computers and brains. I have to say, I think you're the one that's being dishonest. Those were both caricatures. You know that Richard Dawkins went way out of his way again and again to show you how to cash out the metaphor of selfishness and show what it means predictively and explanatorily in evolutionary biology. And that explanatory matrix has been confirmed and extended in hundreds of experiments. You can't understand transposons, you can't understand a great deal of what goes on with genomic imprinting if you don't have that picture, which he brilliantly called picture of selfishness at the gene level. That's one caricature of yours. Then you impose dualism on him, and you impose dualism on me. And that, again, it's a willful caricature. The whole point of my work on minds as software running on brains as computers has been, just as Colin says, to move away from the simple view of a computer like your laptop. No, the brain isn't like your laptop much at all. But it is still, as he says, it's still a computer. And even to the point where we can profitably and predictably think about the downloading of new tricks, new cognitive talents to the brain as much the way we download apps to our iPhones and our computers. Now, your caricatures are very funny, but that's all they are, and that's not the way to deal with serious views.
All right. Well, I hope I can reply to that. First of all, I do think the selfish gene is an exceedingly misleading metaphor. I think that attributing selfishness to genes, he admits it's a metaphor, of course. In the small print of the selfish gene, he says, of course, this is just a metaphor. But I think that Dawkins's metaphors, instead of enlightening research on genes, I mean, he's done very little research on transposons, or actually rather little research at all for many years. I don't think that they're particularly helpful. I think modern research on genes, which shows they're far more complex in networks of interaction, there's epigenetic modifications, it all looks hopelessly old-fashioned now. And I think they're metaphors which have passed their sell-by date. I don't think they've been a very important part of research in actual molecular biology of genes. I think they've had a huge popular effect. His book, The Selfish Gene, has sold vast numbers of copies to people who are not engaged in scientific research. It's had a big social effect. I dispute that it's a key player in the actual workings of biology. And insofar as computer metaphors rely on software and apps, I think they are intrinsically dualistic. I don't think it's a caricature to say they're dualistic. They are. Programs, software, hardware is a kind of dualism. And I think that these app metaphors and computer metaphors do raise a whole question of, they have an implicit dualism, even an explicit dualism, which is not pure mechanism. I don't think they're deliberately dishonest in many cases. I think I'm sorry to say it, Dan, I think it's a confusion of thinking that underlies them. And you'll obviously totally disagree and say I'm caricaturing your view, but I don't think I am.
Do we have that debate would run and run, I know. There's a gentleman there in the